Now, I'm joined by James Woolsey, the former director of Central Intelligence, and Michael Kay, former senior British officer. Thank you. First, let's start with some very recent history. Last week, Mike Morrell, the former CIA deputy director who briefed President Bush on intelligence every day, told me he never told the White House Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons. And yet, here was Vice President Dick Cheney speaking to meet the press just before the invasion. Let's watch.
We know he's been absolutely devoted to trying to acquire nuclear weapons, and we believe he has, in fact, reconstituted nuclear weapons.
Reconstitute nuclear weapons, because Mike Morrell says there was never such a briefing. But if it wasn't nuclear weapons, why did we go into Iraq in the first place? And how do we go back to this blame game? Jim, when you go back to this, you can argue it 4 or 5 ways. One, we broke, it's the old Cohen-Powell argument. You broke it, you bought it. Iraq is all over the place. It was that we used debathification. We threw out all the army people who were Sunni, out of the government, out of the army. They went and joined to become now the military leadership of ISIS. That's an argument. We finally left Iraq. You could say we could have stayed longer. I mean, how do we assign this division of blame as to how we got to ISIS?
And it's very hard to pin it down on any one thing. The chaos in that part of the world is so extraordinary, and the one power that seems to know what it's doing and is expanding relentlessly is Iran. And being Shiite, the power that Iran is building, it dominates 4 capitals in addition to its own.
What are they?
It'd be in Yemen, in Damascus, in
Baghdad,
and in Lebanon. So
they're winning the battle against the Sunnis.
Well, they are scaring the devil out of the Sunnis, and that is one thing I think that has happened with the pulling together of ISIS. That is not the only thing, but when passions get so great as they do in a chaotic situation like this, the angrier and more ideological people come to the fore, and that's what's happening with ISIS.
Michael Kay, what's your sense of what cauldron created the ISIS, who are Sunni people who don't like the Shias who are running Baghdad, don't like the people, the Alawites who are running Syria, and they're right there in the middle building a country that at some point is going to take shape. It's going to be like Jello. It's going to gel at some point and become a country if we don't blow it apart sooner.
Well, Chris, can I start at the beginning? There's accountability at all layers of government at the time in 2003. It started the executive branch by George W. Bush and by Dick Cheney, who woefully underestimated what would happen when you took a dictator who opposed al-Qaeda, but also was the biggest countercheck to Iran in the region at the time. There was a woeful underestimation there. In the legislative branch, 296 lawmakers in the House voted for the resolution on Iraq, as did 77 from the Senate. There's accountability there. At the diplomatic level, you had Paul Bremer, who effectively was heading up the occupational authority at the time, who made the biggest error that I think is out there, which is effectively you dissolved 400,000 Iraqi regime shoulders, many of which were high-level officers with significant contacts who worked in the intelligence agencies, and you basically put them out of work overnight and made them disgruntled. That's not just 400,000 officers and soldiers, that's their families as well, in excess of 1.5 million people. We can go on. You then look at something at the military level in terms of Abu Ghraib and Camp Booker. That effectively, they were the melting pots for the likes of al-Baghdadi, for the likes of Haji Bakr, who is the strategic mastermind of IS, for the likes of Sakhawi, all to get together and start working on how they were going to dominate Iraq post the occupancy. And
who could have seen this coming? Michael, I see that in retrospect, and we can all look in retrospect, but who could have seen coming the overthrow of a Sunni-led government in Baghdad would have led to, and debathification would lead to the creation, basically, of a rebel army in both the territory of Iraq and Syria? Who could have seen that coming and blown the whistle on this before we got that far? Just start right there. Well, the debathification.
I mean, it's an incredibly hard thing to predict, but what I do think we should be doing is trying to learn from the mistakes of the past. The first thing is that when you take out an army and a police force, you leave a power vacuum, which allows anyone to do anything they like, and that's what we're seeing at the moment. That's why ISIS have been allowed to grow in Syria.
Okay, what do we do now? What do we do now?
Okay, what we do now is we understand what the critical capability of ISIS is. And to me, it's the ability to be able to operate asymmetrically. Basically, ISIS play by no rules.
I know.
If America get on the ground, they have to play by rules. There were 180,000 coalition soldiers in 2007 in Iraq, which tamed the insurgency. It didn't beat the insurgency. So what America does through the CIA is it works out who the proxy militias are, because the proxy militias don't have to play by rules. So there's a big question that the US administration need to ask themselves at the moment is, do we play with Iran on this or don't we? And if we don't, then Saudi have to step up to the plate.
You know, I was watching, Jim. It's a horrible story of a bunch of dozen or so personnel carriers, and they're pretty immune to a rocket attack. They're strong armored. They put some suicide bombers in these cockpits, in these front seats. They go driving into the Iraqi army front lines and blow it apart because they're willing to die. And these like Hiroshima explosions going on. How do you fight an army like that? Is Michael K. right? You got to arm your own wild men.
The suicide killings were also an important part of what made things so tough right after the invasion in Anbar and elsewhere, the IEDs and the rest. I think the heart of the matter here that we really ought to keep our eye on is nuclear capability. And Iran may well have it within a year or two, particularly if this treaty or agreement or whatever it is goes forward. North Korea has it now. Russia is being very imperialistic these days. Of course, they have nuclear weapons, and China is doing the same thing in the South China Sea.
You moved the question from Iraq to Iran, but what do we do?
Well, I think that we have to try to reconstitute the cooperative effort in Anbar among the Sunnis that led to produce the surge and made that work. We have to get arms to the Kurds and to the Sunnis and not let them go to Baghdad and just stay there and that's one reason I think Senator Paul's statement is wrong. They've been going to the Shia, our arms have, and they haven't been being passed on to some of the Sunni fighters that we need to help. I think that we can't count on any one sort of solution, but the real problem here is that we may well, within a year or two or three, have a considerably nuclear Middle East. And the next crisis that occurs where Sunni hates Shia and Shia hates Sunni and everybody hates us and Iran hates everybody, it's a different crisis than what we have now and a far more trouble.
Well, I think you're implicitly arguing we shouldn't make a mistake of backing the Shia militia or the Shia-led government in Baghdad to the point where it supports a nuclear deal we shouldn't be making.
ISIS is awful. We have to do what we can
but Iran's more
destroy
dangerous.
them. But Iran and its satraps are.
Are you with that, Michael K.? Do we have to shift our strategic thinking to say it's more important to keep Iran non-nuclear and perhaps hostile than it is to try to warm up toward them?
Look, Chris, there are three main players in Iraq at the moment. You've got the Peshmerga in the northeast, which aren't geographically situated to fight in Anbar province because of the lines of communication. You've got the populist mobilization forces south of Baghdad and to the east, and then you've got the government of Iraq forces that seem to be capitulating quite a lot. They're your three main key players. You have to make an assessment. Can we degrade, not destroy, dangerous word, can we degrade ISIS through the government of Iraq forces, through coalition air power, and through the use of the Peshmerga? If the answer to that, looking at the critical capabilities of ISIS, is yes, then the question is, how do you prevent populist mobilization forces from getting involved in the fight? Because that's difficult.
Thank you, James Woolsey. Thank you, Michael K.